So I'll do a background introduction of the topic, and then I'll present to you the methodology, which I'm calling here today DEED. So you could do a good deed, if you pardon the pun: discovery, enumeration, exploitation, and documentation. Some people wanted me to change it to exploitation, so it would be dead, but I resisted because it really doesn't make sense. But exploitation does sound good. So feel free to modify this or change. It's not official. It's just something I put together for the presentation. So background on the topic. This, for me, is the abridged background of penetration testing. And I think it's important to put this in context because if you look at the history, this is a United States presentation. I'll be doing this in Europe, too, which will have a slightly different slant. But in the United States, if you're familiar, in 1977, there was an attempt in Congress to pass a law. It was by a guy named Ribicoff, and he was trying to restrict access. And that was kind of the beginning of U.S., computer security legislation or awareness. The problem was, it was back then still you're not supposed to do this. And there's a sort of blame the victim portion of this where if somebody throws a rock through your window, you don't go around saying, wow, you shouldn't have windows. You really, took a big risk by having a window in your house. It essentially is looking at the attacker as the problem. And so these computer laws originally were in the 70s focused on that. But nothing really happened until 83, whereas if you're familiar with the United States history, the 414 crew started to cause a bunch of problems. And that was their area code. So back then it was still the phreakers, the hackers. 414 is Milwaukee. So Milwaukee was a hotbed of Boy Scouts who were spending their time learning how to be, what Boy Scouts, I guess, learned to be, which is honorous, generous, hackers, and so forth. Whatever those, I forget I wasn't a very good Boy Scout, obviously. But basically 6 bills came out that year. So in 83 and 84, 6 bills went to Congress. Dan Glickman took the charge up. He was from Kansas as a Democrat. And then later a guy from Texas named Brooks, who's also a Democrat, also in the House of Representatives, took this charge forward and said, we have to protect the United States. There's a subtext here which is really important. Those guys in the House, which were Democrats, were arguing that there should be civilian control of the networks and that the industry should figure out how to protect themselves. Because the other side of that argument was the military in the United States saying it's too risky for our national security to allow civilians to deal with this issue. So in 87, believe it or not, Ronald Reagan is the reason that we passed the Computer Security Act, and he essentially divided up. He allowed the Democrats to argue that the civilians would control the networks unless there was a case of super-sensitive secret information. So he essentially told the military to back off. And ever since then, the military has been coming back, and I'm pointing this out not only because I think it's important as a pen tester, but because I feel like as a civilian pen tester, I often run up into military guys, and they tell me things like, you just don't understand the threat. And you just don't see how China is attacking us. And I say, show me the threat, show me these details, and then we'll talk. But they refuse to do that. So there's a secrecy thing that gets in the way. And pen testing is about transparency. It's about understanding the true threat. So, for example, if you look at the Verizon breach report, it says the Chinese are attacking us about 3% of the time. That's a pretty low number. And they say that because they do investigation down to the individual. Now, if you ask them how many attacks come from China, they say, oh, God, that's 60, 70%. But a lot of that has to do with, and as a pen tester you should appreciate this, the machines in China aren't very well secured. And they're notorious for copying, pirating, sharing, all sorts of gray market, black market software, which inevitably leads to a lot of hacked machines, which leads to attacks from those machines. So you can't trust the source necessarily. Anyway, long story short, there's a divide here in penetration testing between those who are on the civilian side and the military side. Back to, I would suggest you become familiar with the NSDD 145, which is where the NSA was given control over sensitive information by Ronald Reagan, and the civilian side was given control under the Computer Security Act. Now, that's where NIST came from. And NIST is a very good resource for a lot of computer security information. And as a civilian pen tester, I rely a lot on NIST resources, and I'm a big proponent of the civilian control. It was repealed, this Computer Security Act, by FISMA, which is a whole other presentation. So that's a little background. What I've done here is showed you what happened after the civilians got control back or maintained control. People started to talk not just about going after the attackers, but saying, maybe we should do that too. So in 92, you have Belevin, who's talking about using DNS to actually break into systems, right? Stuff we talk about today. People are pretty famous about, Kaminsky talks about this all the time today. But it really started in 92. That was it was a seminal study that wasn't published till 95. In 93, Farmer and Venema posted to the general computer lists how you should improve your security by breaking into yourself. And that was really a turning point. That's probably the first known reference to where people said, as civilians, as people managing our networks, we should be allowed to really do bad things, which they're considered bad before then. But then for me, the turning point was I was working in an environment in 95. This was the beginning of my career, essentially, the beginning of what I consider pen testing, and Satan was being used all the time. You would see UDPs everywhere. Anytime somebody lit up Satan, it would just blast your network. And a lot of people didn't see this, but it was the beginning of where you would say, wow, if there's some weird traffic on my network, that's got to be someone using Satan. So there was automated testing in 95. So here I've presented the top 10 ways you can tell Satan is inside your network. You can see, for example, all keys except the 6 are disabled. Your monitor starts spinning around in circles. This is actually a top 10 list that came out in 95 to help people detect Satan on their network. But some people were really offended by the word Satan, so they came out and renamed it Santa. There's actually a script you can run that renames every reference to Santa, which I'm not sure is better. I've always been afraid of Santa. So why do we talk about security? If I put this back in the context of virtualization, cloud, VMware, right, they do these surveys where they say 93% of those who agree with VMware's definition of security also say that 88% of them would use the cloud if they could get same or better security. So as a tester, you want to see if the cloud is as secure as the environment they're in today. That's really the bottom line. And that's all it's about. Although I will say I love looking at data, and when they say 93% agree with VMware's definition, I think, well, that's 88% of the 93%. I wonder what the other people say. Like maybe if they disagree with VMware's definition, they don't care if it's as good as the security in their environment. But that's neither here nor there. The data that we're looking at, for example, from Gartner, this is from 2009. I went back a few years because I think it's interesting to look at how people thought in 2009 versus today. They said security and privacy by far was a more important than even, say, uptime or skill, which I find ridiculous. Like, who cares more about security than the skill of the people in the cloud that's being run? Or, for that matter, uptime to me is the same as security. If you have no availability, you have no security, by most people's definition. So it doesn't really make sense to me. But the key to this data is that Gartner was asking people to prioritize things, saying what's first, what's second, what's third. And this says a lot of people put security first, and then they started to mix up the others. So it's not really a great statistic. I think a better way to look at it is like, here's a survey where they say, just rate them. Tell us what's most important from 1 to 5. Now you see security and availability show up right at the top. Strange how data works, huh? It's like Mark Twain used to say, there are liars, damn liars, and then there's data about breaches. So you have here people responding about security and availability being the most important thing to them. So again, pen testers' job is to find out where the breaches are, where the risks are. But now we have this problem if we fast forward to today. This is the most recent graph I could pull. This is the record of breaches up to right now off of DataLossDB. If you're looking at this as a pen tester, you're thinking, wow, breaches are going down. Looks like things are getting safer, right? The problem with this data is that it's very misleading. So if you look at the ITRC, the Identity Theft Resource Center, they actually show that hacking is now the largest number of breaches in 2011. So you might be looking at the DataLossDB data and thinking that overall breaches are going down, but the breaches that are related to pen testing are going up, right? People are losing less laptops. Maybe there are people that are losing less RAID devices, like physical access is going down, but hacking the cloud could actually be skyrocketing. And that's actually what the data is showing. 37% of breaches are due to malicious attacks on computer systems. That's double 2010. And of course, LulzSec, Anonymous could have something to do with this. It could be an aberration of just some kids, again, like the 414 crew who made their point. A lot of laws came out and it sort of disappeared, right? It's not like the world ended after the Milwaukee kids in 83, 84 did their hacking, as the military predicted. So let me drill down a little bit. What we see is that if you look at incidents by breach of all time, 16% are by hackers, pen testers, if you will. That changes dramatically if you look at just the last month. It jumps to 43%. So I think what we're actually seeing is a trend towards people learning how to use tools like Satan at a younger age who maybe have less to lose or maybe getting paid. Motives, means, opportunity, shifting. The cloud now presents an attractive target for people who have the ability to attack it. So that's why we're pen testing. And ultimately, if you look at the Verizon breach report, as I mentioned, 3% from China were attacking us. They say 50% of the attacks are hacking. I see a lot of people cite this study. Verizon does a great job. I have a lot of beef with it, but I'll leave that for another presentation. The malware is what gets cited the most, right? A lot of stuff is malware related. You should still use antivirus. Verizon will tell you that patching isn't working. There are all these arguments people slice different ways. For today, I just want to point out that there are a lot of people who are actually actively trying to get in your network using tools and pen testing. So that's the background. So the goal today is really to set up and run a pen test in your environment and then to get the most benefit from that test. Those are two different things in my mind. Just the other day, a guy said to me, I'm an engineer, I'll solve this for you. And I said, that's great, but what I don't know is if you're a good engineer. So I'm going to try to tell you not only how to do a pen test, but why pen tests are effective to stop that trend. So hopefully we'll start to see the data decline. My goal here is to help you get that number down so it doesn't continue to go up. Oh, and I skipped over the Lorax principle here, which is that you really have to care. If you've done pen testing, I think you do it out of caring about your environment. It's like you test your vehicle before you drive it, or you have someone test it for you, your bicycle, your horse, whatever. You want to make sure it's in good condition before you put your life on it. So I think that's really what pen testing is about, which might not be the perspective someone else might give you when they say all attackers are bad. There is a place for tests. Doctors run tests on you, for example, and in a sense, when they put antivirus or they put viruses in you to protect you in the flu season, they're attacking you. So what we're going to do is set up and run a cloud penetration test by looking at how to scope it, the rules, and the tools you'll use. And then we'll talk about the results and the documentation you'll get out of it, all based on doing good. Now, if you look at the Lorax from an evil, you put your evil hat on, the horns here, and you start to think about how am I going to attack my environment, or if someone hires you, how are you going to attack someone else's environment? It boils down to you set up a timeline, you figure out the resources you're allowed, and then you set up the profiles that you might want to use. So you have internal tests, external tests, unprivileged. I generally consider these great computer science skills. There's a huge increase in social science skills, right? People love to do social engineering. I, for one, I love social engineering. I love physical tests. I got into this room without using my badge. I've gotten into several presentations. My badge reads, it says, sorry, denied, and then I make up a story and they let me in, which is easier than if I go back down and get it fixed. So I just do that as a regular practice. I have a whole presentation on social engineering, but bottom line is everyone does it all the time. We just don't necessarily recognize it. And if you go home and you say hi to your spouse in a way that you want them to feel better, you're social engineering. If you try to get a room upgrade in the casino, you're social engineering. We do it all the time for all sorts of reasons. We try to get things from other people. But some people are making an art of it where they go up against an unknown adversary, or they go into an environment and they say, I wonder, I'm just curious, can I get in? And that's back to the 414 group. They were just curious kids who wanted to know if they could get in and get something they weren't supposed to get. Mitnick's probably the most famous example of that, and he has a book about why he did it. So overall, there are threat profiles that you look at, and here are the different levels that I put together. You can do bigger graphs, smaller graphs, but if you're going to set up a pen test, you really need to figure out what's the level you're going to operate at. Are you going to use a lot of resources and be intensely committed, or are you really just going to do a short test with a little bit of power? So are you testing at a level that's relevant to who's attacking you? What are the assets you're protecting is another way of looking at it, which I'll get to in a second. So more technically speaking, there are rules that you're allowed to do when you do tests. So small or micro, you may be familiar with Amazon. I may mention a bunch of different vendors. I don't have a preference, but I will beat up on people when I think it's appropriate. I mean, they say, for example, you can't do small or micro testing, right? Because they want to prevent potential adverse performance impacts that you may be sharing with other customers. Well, that kind of says to me right away, like, if you test us, we'll fail. So you're not allowed to test. That doesn't really sound good to me. I would want to go with somebody who says, you can use any instance you want if you care about the assets in that instance, because you should be allowed to test it for virulence. Like if you care about going down. On the other hand, they'll say, we'll never go down, and yet they went down, right? There's a really good blog post about how a guy working inside Amazon, who was an engineer, was told when he was hired, you will never see an outage here. And they laughed, and we'll never see an outage. And then he was one of the guys blogging about the outage that they had, and he was like, well, that's what they told me. How did we miss that? It happens. So another thing to consider is collaborative and covert, where you want to know if people are going to work together on the test or whether you're going to come in completely unannounced. I recommend coming in with documentation. Highly recommended. I walked into a facility once that was next door to the ICE, the Immigration Control, for the United States, and they're pretty serious people. They carry guns. They're very serious about their perimeter. That's what they exist for, is perimeter security. And I walked right through their perimeter thinking I was going to test another facility, and once I was inside, I thought, this doesn't look right. And I walked out, and they came chasing after me. And I was like, no, I swear I'm authorized to test the building next to you. And it was pretty sticky. But that's why I say you need to keep credentials. You get a get-out-of-jail card, something you can say, okay, game's over. I got in. I'm really supposed to be doing this. If you don't do it that way, you pretty much have to live with the consequences if somebody pulls a gun or somebody tries to put you in jail. And that's happened a few times to me. So you also want to know if you want to do debriefed or blind. I recommend debriefed because it saves time, but blind sometimes is nice because, oftentimes developers don't really know themselves. And if they give you a debriefing, you're actually maybe taking up more time by going with what they tell you, which is incorrect. If you go blind, you have a blank slate, you can find things they never even biased you with. There is a lot of confirmation bias, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but I find, for example, the Stuxnet issue I have a big beef with right now. I think that it was very poorly reported. I'm completely in the opposite end of the camp from the Wired report, for example. I don't think they asked anyone who disagreed with them for an opinion. If you read it, and it's a very comprehensive review, it says, Symantec did this work, Symantec says it was a really bad problem, Symantec fixed the problem. Wow. It doesn't say, Symantec says this is a problem, but all these other people say it's not a problem. And there are other resources like Nate Lawson who will tell you, he's not impressed or it wasn't that sophisticated. To that point, I cornered the guy who says it was sophisticated, Joe Weiss, and I said, what is it about it that makes it sophisticated? I want to know as a pen tester, how sophisticated should my attacks be? What was sophisticated about Stuxnet? And he said, it's the first time we saw it. So as a philosophy student, I just looked at him and I said, look, the first time you saw something, that's it? That's the definition of sophisticated? At that moment, I wish I had a banana in my pocket because I'd pull it out and say, never seen this banana before, have you? How sophisticated is my banana? Really? That's just not a good enough definition for me. I have a whole definition of 0 days that's different. But ultimately, my point is that, you have to know when you're going to go in how sophisticated your attack should be, how much you should know about your networks, or the environment you're going to test, and so forth. You have application and database, or just the application. You have starting the stopped instances. This is actually an interesting point for PCI compliance testing. They will say, for example, for wireless, you have to test all the time. Constantly look for things that are not on your network. You don't have wireless, but you have to look for wireless. Yet, if you ask about testing for an ASV, which is a scanning vendor, the ASVs do not have to look for systems that are off, which kind of makes sense, because if you're scanning in a time zone where they're in bed, then their systems are turned off, you don't have to scan them. Well, it kind of doesn't make sense because they might wake up tomorrow and then the company will be vulnerable. So starting stop systems is this weird sort of space that's being defined still. Another example of that actually is in the new virtualized environment. The guidance that just came out from the PCI Council says you should be aware of the risk of systems which are dormant, which is like saying, again, you should scan systems that are offline, yet for the ASVs, you don't have to scan systems which are offline. Part of the scope of a pen test is to figure this out. There's no perfect answer. And then exploitation is really, as I talked about with Stuxnet, what really defines an exploitation? So denying service, again, for Amazon's purposes, is not allowed to be tested. You're not limited in your selection of tools, but you are limited in your selection of tools. So they kind of say both things. And what they say you can't do are protocol floods, resource request floods. So if your definition includes denial of service, you kind of have to cut that out if you use their service. And you can only look for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, and so forth. All right, so to set it up, you're going to use tools, and you're going to do some manual testing maybe, some automated testing, some custom testing. And originally it felt like when I did pen testing like 10, 15 years ago, we did a lot of this. It was just like 4 phases, go straight through, discovery, enumeration, exploitation, documentation. But over time, it seemed like we did a lot more of this. We did a little bit of discovery. People would just give us a list of machines. This is our network. This is what you'll test. And then you do this enumeration where you're like, well, what is it? Is it an AS400? Is it a mainframe? And then you run like one exploit just to prove your point if they disagreed with you. And then you end up with like a 500-page document. The heavier, the better. If it made a sound, the thud test, then they were satisfied with the report. I saw this all the time, actually AS400s. Speaking of them, I remember a vendor, I won't mention the name, but they came in and they tested it and they said, all the ports are turned off, so you're good to go. You've got port 80 and port 443, you're secure. But of course, if you test the back end, the thing was like Swiss cheese. They had like everybody in the company getting in and using QSEC offer. They had all these people using all these different levels of privilege, no logging. So big test to tell you that your ports are turned off. It was just like an early Nmap report that was just all of the data, totally useless. So this is what I recommend instead. I recommend you, if you're going to do like a resource assessment, you spend a lot of time on discovery. That's really, really useful these days because that's what's happening in the real world. People are doing a lot of discovery to find information out. You're not required by compliance to do a lot of discovery or even protect yourself from information disclosure. Like the levels in PCI, 1 through 5, it stops at level 2. So level 3, 4, and 5 are basically the ability to control a machine or access a machine. Level 2 is where you find out something interesting, like SNMP traffic or something. So discovery, I think, is important for purposes of pen testing, but not necessarily for compliance. Then there's enumeration, also very important. At that point, I think exploitation is important, but again, not as important as the documentation. So I think that's a slightly different approach than other pen testers. Some people focus 100% on exploitation. So choose your pen tester for what the rewards you want are. And from that perspective, this is where I really talk about the core of the pen test. You do threat models like I talked about. You set up rankings to figure out what you want. And then the risk assessment really should come out being asset focused. I think it's super important if you work with people to do pen tests, they should say, I just care about the assets that I need to protect, right? Focus it down on stuff that's really risky if it's lost. How many people have heard of the Shinogi incident? A couple people? All right, Shinogi was a company, the name doesn't really matter, but bottom line is these guys had a bit of a HR issue, so they let go of a consultant, and he kept accessing their network for months from his home. I mean, it wasn't like he was trying to hide. He was still accessing as a consultant from his home after he was terminated. Well, he left, sorry. His contract was ended, so he left. And then his boss, who had brought him in, was let go as a layoff. And then he accessed the network from a McDonald's. And this has made the news as a McDonald's incident. But if you read the case itself, you see that he was coming in for a long time before he even got to McDonald's. The way they tied it to McDonald's is he made a $4.96 purchase at the time that he accessed the network. So that's great for district attorneys. They love that kind of detail. But for a pen tester or for like someone who protects networks, you have to look at that and go, wow, 6 months he was like coming in from his home network even though he wasn't authorized to, and he was installing things. So 1, access, 2, change control, all the standard stuff. This is also being written up as a vSphere incident because he came in and used vSphere to delete the entire environment, and they're estimating up to $1 million of damage now. It's getting bigger and bigger as time goes on because he deleted their entire IT infrastructure essentially. Well, did somebody not test to see that you could come in remotely? They are claiming it's an insider attack, but he was termed, he was gone long before he came in. So it's an insider-outsider blend attack. Anyway, it's all about the assets. That is a very good case of where their assets were wide open, hanging in the breeze. And just about anybody, he could have sold that information, right? So it's who do you trust and how do you go after them for doing that? And why didn't they have a backup and so forth? All right, so let's look at the threats. If we map those threats like that guy using something like Dread, I think Dread is kind of heavy. Microsoft developed it. So I'll give you Dread Lite. It's like high, medium, and low across a couple different or 5 different categories. You really want to look for damage, reproducibility, exploitability, how many users are affected, and discoverability. And I've shortened the descriptions here. So if the damage is high, right, like you get root access, that's pretty bad. And if it's totally at the bottom, it's like discoverability is known and it's low, then it's pretty easy. So this is something that I think is really helpful because at the bottom you see a Dread result after a scan. You find a password. What do you do about it? Well, it looks like if you do this, it's going to affect a lot of users. It's going to be easily exploitable. It's easily reproduced. It does a lot of damage, right? It kind of makes sense. It's highest on your list. I won't belabor that. The point here is, again, just make sure you're focusing it on assets. Because strangely enough, if you look at the Microsoft recommendation, it's not like they say focus on assets. They leave that up to you. Figure out your own business. But I really, really have to emphasize that. Something that I found in my work with a lot of companies is they get really annoyed if you show them exploits that are really, really fascinating to you and they don't care about them at all. That insulin pump is totally vulnerable. And they're like, that has nothing to do with our business. Somebody left that here. So methodology, deed. Let's go into the details of doing this. Actually, before I move a little bit further, let me ask, I had a couple questions I wanted to make sure I understood the audience. Who's in the cloud today? Who has workloads, I should say valuable assets in the cloud? Okay, a few people. And how many of you are providers, service providers to other people? Okay, cool. How many of you were at Black Hat? A couple people. Okay, good. Cool. So let's talk about the deed. How to do a good deed. Now, one more question. Does anybody know what Theobroma is? Have you watched the show Wilfred? I don't watch a lot of TV, but I got turned on to this show, and there's this episode, it's just awesome, where apparently this guy goes like slightly crazy and starts talking to his dog, and his dog is in human form, and his dog is a sinister, evil, like crazy, like just character. It's almost like a jester character. And the dog calls him on the phone and plays this classic movie villain, and he says, I couldn't let you do what you were going to do. I just disagreed with you, and so in order to prevent you, to stop you, I had to feed you like Theobroma. I've laced that brownie you just ate with it. And he races off to the hospital. He gets there. He asks the doctor, what am I poisoned with? He's like, I feel so sick. What's going on? My dog, he poisoned me with this horrible... And he's like, you turned up totally negative. There's nothing. He's like, not even Theobroma? And the doctor says, well, yeah, that's chocolate. There's chocolate in your system. And the dog's like, well, it would have worked on me. How did I know that you were immune to Theobroma? So that's what this is about. Doing the attacks that are most relevant. So discovery. I'll run through some diagrams here. They're meant as teasers. You can figure them out yourself, maybe in a different way than I'm going to present them. But this is, for example, a 3-tiered data flow diagram I put together where you have outside, inside traffic, communication, in other words. You're going to look at all the ingress traffic, all the egress traffic, like the Shinogi case. Really good tests there. Who can get in? Who still has access? Data formats. I mean, it's not just about ports, but it's also about like communication flow. And then transaction level, this is, you see a white box. This is to represent the provider's space. So if you look at some of the new guidance, it says people, merchants, for example, aren't responsible for the security of environments. A lot of that responsibility has been shifted into the provider. So what that really means is the transactions and the storage of those data flows are going to be really important. And a lot of the access you see in transaction and storage space is pretty risky. The Dropbox incident, for example, where they came out and said, hey, we told you that we have encryption keys to all of your data. And people said, no, you didn't. And they said, well, did you sign up and get your own key? Well, who do you think has a key then? It's kind of obvious to us, but it wasn't clear. So providers are in this role of where they're supposed to protect your data, but they may have access to your data that you don't even know about. They're telling you it's encrypted, but they don't tell you that it's encrypted with the key that they carry. So transaction storage space is really important to figure out who has access, not just how the technology works. A diagram I use often in some internal documents that are going to be public soon from VMware, and some probably are public already. This breaks up the data flow for different levels of responsibility. So you get application managers who oftentimes might have come from the existing enterprise environment, right? So your administrators have access through an API or a portal into the cloud environment, and then you get these 3 layers below. These are roles, really. So if you're an attacker, you want to say, what can I do as an application admin? Okay, that's from the outsider's view. That's the cloud customer. Now what can I do as a business administrator, which is like where you design the services that are offered to customers? So, for example, you offer some people web hosting, but then you offer other people FTP. What if somebody can get into that account and turn on FTP? That's a business management attack, right? Service catalog, service provision, turning up services inside the cloud environment. Orchestration is where you start to get to some of the automation. Where, what if I decide that the way that they've automated this leaves a flaw? Really good example of that was when they started popping up thousands and thousands or even tens of thousands of WordPress installations. And the automation process set up the UMask so that everyone could see each other's files. And, of course, the password for the database was in one of those files. So somebody wrote a quick script and said, well, this automation is cool. I'll just automate my own script that goes and pulls all the passwords from everyone's database file. Now I'm going to insert pages into everyone's website, so if you go to their website, you get my malicious JavaScript inserted. And that was a service management attack. Right? Somebody went after the way that the automation works. They figured out that the UMask was set wrong everywhere. And then there's a question of who's responsible for that. And then infrastructure management, of course, is the more traditional stuff we're used to. Those are the guys that are doing the actual technical work on the back end of setting up and configuring the hypervisors. That's where a lot of people like to talk about risk today. But I think these upper layers are just as important, or more important sometimes. This is a data flow diagram that just flew across my desk the other day. I could ask, it's a big audience, so I'll just go ahead and tell you. Normally I would ask people, like, what do you see wrong in this? But you notice how the vMotion network and the storage network just sort of go off into space? I'm like, where does that end? Someone's desk, someone's closet. The Terry Childs case in San Francisco, not a lot has been said publicly about it that's really, really interesting. So I think there's a lot of data that still has to come out. But some of the things that I've found is that guy had a mirror of the entire environment. He had set up the network so that all the traffic that flowed through their environment also went to a little literally a locked cabinet where he was caching the data or something. He was like a man-in-the-middle attack for his own network. And when they finally fired him and got rid of him, they're like, what are these servers connected to? What are they doing? There's 2 terabytes of encrypted storage just like in there. And they still don't know what's really on him or what he was doing. But, when you look at diagrams like this and you figure out who's attacking you, maybe it's an insider connected in, caching all of your data, especially for a vMotion, right? This is a big issue. People ask all the time, when are you going to encrypt vMotion? And the response is, well, it's supposed to be protected. That's your back end. It's totally secure, 100%. So if you do pen tests, find out where the vMotion traffic is, because that's supposed to be secure. That's a really good, juicy finding in a pen test report. Some other things here are like the C management network versus the AB management network. AB management network connected makes sense. These are failovers, clusters, and so forth. C, failover but not connected, not likely. It's probably connected to something. Maybe they do it that way, but I have a feeling that the AB guys are going to set up the C environment if there's a disaster, so they're probably going to come in some way. So there's something missing from this, the way I look at it. That's a good way to look at the discovery. Here's another discovery. This is an actual environment that I've tried to distill out the important details. So the big question for me here is broadcast domains. If you remember collision domains, hubs, they were really cool because you could sit on and sniff everything. You pull all your traffic back. Well, then we went to these away from collision domains to broadcast domains. So VLAN tags. Anybody sit in the previous session? Were you on the panel that I was on before? Okay. Well, I'm going to repeat a little bit. But with VLAN tags, it was really interesting because the people who sell the network equipment will tell you it's secure. VLANs are safe, which makes sense. They're selling it to you. So I would say don't always trust that, because the VLAN tag issue was they had figured out how to secure the tags. If you wanted to change it, couldn't do it. Lots of levels of controls. But if you replaced it by putting a second tag, when the first tag was read, the second tag was still there, and sometimes the switches would read the second tag. So they figured out one piece, but they didn't figure out the second piece, and so the attack was born. And then they said, okay, we fixed that. You're safe again. So the problem with vendors that sell you the security is that you oftentimes have to do tests independent of what they're telling you. Broadcast domains is a very good place to look. So if you're doing discovery, look at the broadcast domains and networks and see where they really flow. This red, I don't know if you can see the colors, but the red BT5 is an example of how I've inserted a backtrack, which I'll use later in the presentation, into an environment way back in the back end. And I'm connected, you see here, with that bottom VLAN, because that's where the really juicy bits are. To get to that backtrack, of course, I have to come in, and you can see on the, I guess that would be your left side, there's a vShield edge, which is dual connected, that bypasses the load balancer. So these are things that are interesting to figure out. Can you embed something inside an environment and then have it talk back to you? Very common attack. A lot of the RSA attack documentation, when they got the keys, remember when they got the secure ID keys and stuff, talks a lot about how that reverse administration works. You send somebody a PDF. This goes back to what's your scope of the engagement. If you can send people malicious PDFs that install backdoors that then call back to you, you can get a direct access line into an environment like this. But you just want to make sure you're in the system in a place where you can get access to the back end. It goes back to the vMotion network and so forth. So this data flow diagram is meant to show, if you discover the true network and everything in it, and you can figure out where you should embed your attacks, you can get really close to the data that people say can't be accessed. Incidentally, that big box with the gray stuff in it, that's the traditional networking equipment, which has a million controls in it. But why even bother looking at that stuff? You just want to get into the machine all the way in the back end, right? Virtualization's cool that way. This is an actual assessment that was put in my inbox, and I looked at it, and I just thought, this can't be true. Like, these can't really all be connected. And I guess the thing that jumped out at me right away was they have their PBX directly connected into what looks like their database backend, their SAN fabric, their virtual infrastructure. That giant green space in the middle is their floating virtualization cloud, right? Which is all connected into the SAN for storage and the databases. It looks really cool until you realize that when you diagram it all out, it's really connected to everything, including phones. And just in case, if you're at Black Hat or B-Sides, you would see that they're re-releasing phone scanners now. So the war dialers are becoming more and more sexy. They run out of the cloud. They do all sorts of really, really sophisticated, cool stuff now. People are getting back into it. So they also have physical equipments here. You can see there's HP-UX. There's Microsoft Windows 2008. So again, you want to get into virtualization, you can go through the side channel. But it's all based on your discovery. Make sure you're asking about, do you have modems? Believe it or not, people still connect modems into their environment for a lot of reasons. Another way to do this is just at the application layer. So for this example, you see here request data coming from an external source to a database server. Again, a real diagram. No idea what that would be. But people are communicating on the back end directly to something. If I'm going to attack this environment, if I find out that they have an input-output source, let's say that they're a huge data warehousing environment and they have to get their data from some other company, partnerships, SLAs, I'd go after that. Because the back end controls, generally, the back door are not as secure as the front door. Really good example of this was I can't even say the industry, but this huge environment where they brought me in. I've probably seen every control possible in the physical environment. I like physical because it's very tangible. In the front end, military man traps, bulletproof glass, turnstiles where you can only walk a couple inches, to get through. And then they have black and white checkered foot-tall checks everywhere so they can tell your height from all the cameras that are focused. All this crazy stuff. So you get into these environments. They walk you down these mile-long halls with tons of cameras on. And I'm always like, front door, blah, 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 right? Show me the back door, right? Because the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, fire escape. So I always use the smoker example. A lot of people allow people to go out the back door for smoking. They prop the door. I always look for prop doors. I always look for people who need to use facilities, bathrooms, right? I look for human function flaws. Another one that came up recently was these guys had a parking lot that came up to the basement. So they decided to put a cage over that to prevent people from dropping into the basement because the basement is where their front door access was, and they didn't want people to come in that route. And I was like, that's brilliant. You're preventing people from getting to, through some unknown way at night or something to your front door. But you've just built a ladder to your first floor. And you could climb up the ladder. Literally, I was like, what are you thinking? And they were like, wow, we had so much money set aside to build that thing. So thank you for saving the money. But I was like, you still have a problem, but I'm just saying don't build another problem. You literally could just walk up to the first floor. And the first floor was, incidentally, a cloud data center. So great idea. And then further up the fire escape, they had a bunch of door problems. I don't know, it's just... So my point is back door. Look at the back door, data flow, physical, whatever it is. Think about human function. Think about business function. Think about the way people think about their environment. Don't look just at the technology. But then if you're going to look at technology, you have to go look at the authentication and request. That's usually broken. Always look at the authentication path. All right, last example, real-world case. This was advertised by a competitor, a cloud provider, and they said, wow, this is really cool. We've got this huge thing set up. This is for critical infrastructure even. And it seemed kind of strange to me because when I read through all the documentation, and I'm not attacking this environment. I'm just saying this was published as marketing news by the company. Look how cool we are. We're in the cloud. And they said, we do FTP into this environment, and then we use HTTP to access it, and then we have this back-end connection. So I've highlighted in 3 spaces here. If I was going to go after them, I would look at, wow, FTP, I'm going to look at your authentication. Front end, HTTP, also authentication. Back end, you have this huge connection with this SDK wrapper. I'm going to download the SDK and see if I can write my own wrapper and see if you even authenticate me or if I can take all your data. I mean, they're discovering, this is super high asset critical infrastructure stuff. They even built their own rich client interface, which I think was in Visual Basic. So they've got VB components here, right? So they're disclosing tons of information as a press release that's just like attacker rich. I think that's why the numbers are going up. So that's discovery. So what do you do when you discover, right? I've talked about this a little bit indirectly, so let me talk about it directly now. If you're going to attack the database, right, you might want to look at indirect relationships, like find a password somewhere else in the world, see if that password still works, or see if people email in emergencies. This is the H.B. Gary case. You send a fake email, say, oh my God, everything's on fire, I need to move the database, but I don't have the password. What is it? And if they send it to you in email, you're golden. Or if you just go and look at the email, look for passwords, look for the word password. A long time ago, probably the first year of PCI, I was in a fight with a point-of-sale device manager, and he was like, it's scrubbed. There's definitely no point-of-sale device information on there. It's encrypted when there is information. So I waited until one of the kiosks was offline. They shut down for the end of the day. Kiosks used for like the cafeteria. And they used their own point-of-sale for their own cafeteria, which made it a very nice testing environment for me. So I did the discovery. I found this, off the chart, sort of like out in this remote location cafeteria facility. And then I went and I just quickly put a USB stick on, did a scan for the word Visa, did a scan for AMEX, right? 30,000 credit cards, boom. Went back and I was like, I found all these credit cards. It's like, wow, that's cool. I guess we'll fix that. I was like, I thought you told me there's no credit card data. And he's like, well, I guess you found it in the logs. We store it in the logs. So... in case you have to go back, of course, made sense. I could tell story after story about logs. Printers, excellent resource of rich material. People have printers, especially the newer printers with large hard drives, where a lot of people share that, right? Co-tenants, multiple people, multiple companies sharing printers, multiple people sharing scanners. Anytime anyone uses the word caching, right? Caching is really important because you'll find residue. Actually, some people just announced really widespread memory caching, kind of like Memcached, but if you can share someone else's memory cache, you should see how much memory you can get out that's not yours. Right? It's kind of the opposite of buffer overflows. It's like buffer removal. So in that case, you have attack the database here, and I've highlighted read email. But you can also just look to see if the ports are open directly. You can see if there are input fields, which I'll talk about in detail. Okay, so in enumeration, there are a lot of different things to talk about here. One of the challenges of this presentation is I have a million things I could cover. Deep, wide, industry. So I'll break it down this way. Here are 3 things to really look for. You should look for communication channels to enumerate. You should look for authentication and authorization. And you should really look at software. Software is like the huge attack thing now. So let me jump right into it. Names, IPs, and ports. There's some pretty cool tools that come on Backtrack. I recommend checking out Backtrack because it's free. You can use whatever tool you want. But DNS enumeration, for example, is a Perl script. Super simplistic. It just does what DNS does, and it pulls out all of the DNS addresses for a domain. You might use this as an administrator just to check your own records. It's kind of useful. Use that as an attacker, though, because you want to know all the things you want to focus on. That's just an example of how you're going to start to enumerate what somebody's doing. Like You can see here basic setup. Another example is if you take DNS Recon, you might want to do it at a top-level domain because now it tells you something slightly different, right? Microsoft has this profile if you go to Microsoft.com, but if you hit anything with the word Microsoft, they're all over the place, right? All these different countries. Some not even owned by Microsoft, probably. There might be some sort of, trademark issues. The point being, in a virtualized environment, people often don't know what they have. A lot of times they bring stuff up, down, and a lot of developers get access to images, and they start to replicate images because it's so easy. So discovery tools that enumerate what actually is going on in your environment, super important. So here's an example that I ran. I ran Fierce, which is also a Perl script, and this also does some pretty simple stuff. Nothing really sophisticated, just easy. You think about who's attacking you. So what Fierce does for Apple.com, for example, is it tells you that they have an iCloud status host. You might ask, how did it get that? Well, it did these 1,895 tests, and if you open up the Perl script, all it's doing is a brute force of names. So if you add your own names, you can do some pretty cool brute forcing. If you know anything in your discovery phase about what the company does, like cloud, or maybe they have a product name, you can put that in, run those tests, and it'll start to tell you, oh yeah, I found a host way over in Singapore that's related to this company that does what they do. And then you look for the ports, of course, to see if you can get in. Here's another one that came up recently, scanning for SSL. So to figure out what level of SSL they're running, this is an actual scan on a virtualized environment where I found that they had configured it for 40-bit RC4. They had no idea. It's not too long ago. And so there's a lot of discussion about, oh my God, how did that happen? What was a default config? They had installed Tomcat with the config without changing it and going through the trouble of looking for this. So this is what penetration tests are really about these days, I think. It's that you need to clean up the low-hanging fruit, look at all the default configs and so forth. I'll talk about the sophisticated in a bit, but I think a lot of this is really the key to enumeration, going through regularly and finding out stuff. How many people have heard of the MetaGoofill? No, MetaGoofill just searches Google. I mean, you could do it yourself, but it automates it through Python so that it'll tell you stuff about what people are doing. I won't tell you the company I ran this on, but you can run it on any company you want, and it'll tell you the usernames that on all the documents that are public. So you know how you can have profile information. So I found all these usernames inside the company because they publish Word documents, PDFs. I found that they copied other people's files, of course. People working at one company are now on someone else's files because they plagiarized it. It also tells you all the versions of software that are out there. It'll tell you it was saved in Microsoft Word 11, 10, and so forth. It's pretty high level. It's just discovery turning into enumeration. So you know their domain name. Now you know all their files. What you start looking for is data relative to the environment that you're going to attack. And this maybe is one of the best examples. This is an Amazon attack. It just came out. How many people have heard of Bucket Finder? Not a lot? All right. Well, I created my own bucket list. New meaning. It basically scans to find all of the usernames, again, brute force using a dictionary. I just downloaded a quick English dictionary, like 80,000 terms, not huge, and then it runs all those terms against Amazon and tells you if somebody has a backup. But here's the really cool thing. I found this user called Anna, and you see that CIH extension? Anybody know what CIH stands for? That's a virus. So anyway, as an attacker, you sometimes want to be careful what you find. So I didn't want to, you can download, there's actually a tool that says download. If you run the download flag on this, it would download all the stuff that it finds in everyone's public directories. I don't know if you know what buckets are, but these buckets are people's backups. So you're basically backing up, you're basically downloading like PDFs. You could download every PDF that every cloud user has in Amazon because they configured it to be public. And even if it's not public, you can try to brute force it. That's another story. But so the discovery leading to enumeration, once you know they're running in Amazon, you can try to find out what you can get, and you can actually get infected by Treblinka. CIH is the Treblinka virus. Or you can send that user an email. I don't recommend doing that and say, you're infected. All right, so let's talk about software. Right, here's an example of using HTTP print. It uses a signatures file that tells you what's going on in your environment. And you might think, so you're enumerating web servers. Everyone does that. But again, this tool is pretty handy because you can configure it how you want. So I've configured it with my own signature here. You can see derived signature. It'll find all the vSphere instances. Really easy to do. So now you can run this on the world. You can run it in your environment. You can run it on your developers to see how many of them are installing vSphere. I mentioned the Shinogi attack. That guy installed vSphere. Nobody noticed. Well, if you're running a tool like this, you'll find vSphere installed without authorization. Of course, there's change controls too, but this is just a way to see that it's listening. And then you can look for communication channels to it. You can see if anyone's connected to it through the logs because you can look for that IP address in your firewalls or your routers. So, pretty cool. So I'll tell you something about software. Here's somebody who's already built this for you if you don't want to do it yourself. If you use Shodan HQ, how many people have heard of Shodan? Yeah, so Shodan's kind of cool. I mean, it's doing the same thing. It's basically going around the world and looking for instances of software. So if you run the word ESX, for example, it found 186 ESX instances in the United States. What I want to point out here is that it's in the domain name. So some people cleverly made their server name ESX. And then it gives you a 302, right? So it tells you that the server is listening and it's redirecting. But generally a 302, this goes back to enumeration, isn't just telling you that you've got your network diagram, but now you find 302, that's PHP generally. It's a redirect for PHP. So you might not know that you're running PHP. Or maybe you think, okay, I'll find out some more. So in this case, I figured, well, maybe they're running Jetty or something interesting, because there are a lot of Jetty flaws. And a lot of cloud stuff's written in Jetty. So sure enough, this isn't the same IP, this is a different one, but I ran some scans and I found, hey, look, somebody in AWS in Europe is running Jetty 2. Jetty 2 really means that they're doing a load balance. See, LB server equals Jetty 2. So now I'm like, okay, they have a load balancer, they're running Jetty on their web servers. So I keep digging and I find, oh, they're running Jetty 429, which is a Windows-based Jetty. That's pretty cool, because the current version is like 6.5 or something, or 7. So now I'm like all over it, right? I found a cloud instance. I found that these are simple tools anybody can run. My whole theory is that this stuff is really, really easy to do. I think the sophisticated attacks are interesting, but not usually relevant to the assets that you have in your environment. And ultimately, I think I'm proven right by the breach data. The rise, I think, is coming from more tools available to more people who have less to lose or more to gain. So, exploitation. This is the fun part of the presentation. And actually, before I get to exploitation, I just want to mention, I've heard one of the coolest stories the other day. This guy was telling me how the Bay Area, I'm from San Francisco, but the Bay Area almost got shut down recently. Like the Navy was in full force, ready to close all of the bridges, quarantine the entire area. This guy is really interesting. He's another security guy who works at the Air Quality Resource Board. So has anyone heard of tularemia? I think it's called tularemia. No? Yeah, it's not like I heard of it either. It's this really weird fever condition that comes from, like, hunters get it because they kill rabbits and they skin them, and it's like this fever condition that comes from animals, right? So it went off the roof one day on one of their sensors. I hope I'm not stealing his thunder. But from that reading, they were like, oh my God, there's an attack coming. And I would never think that that's an attack. I would think a fever, like people get fevers all the time. But then I did the research and I found, like, in the 50s and the 60s, the United States, like, manufactured tularemia bombs and, like, used them in Alaska and Arizona as, like, chemical warfare theory stuff for, like, fighting the Russians and trying to figure out. And there's no real antidote. It's considered like anthrax, but it dissipates faster. Anyway, so it went off the roof. The Navy motivated, started to. They just happened to be in town, I guess, so they decided they're going to, like, take care of business. And then somebody pointed out that the jacket of the person who was, like, reading the sensor, who was on the roof, who was taking readings from the sensor or moving it or something, had been exposed to a rabbit that died. And, that one sensor was used. So exploitation is a funny business. When you look at data and you try to figure out what really is attacking or what really is going to work, sometimes it's these weird other channels. And even if it does work, that doesn't mean anything in terms of your response. Maybe somebody can get in, like throw your sensor off. But that doesn't mean you should respond because one of your sensors detects an attack. So with that in mind, this is a study that came up on the VMware blog, so I wanted to mention it, right? It's an X-Force study that showed that there are 106 CVEs for ESXi. And it really is a hockey stick, like curve. So if you look at VMware and the number of flaws, or CVEs, if you will, that have been reported, it goes up pretty fast. As it gets popular, more flaws found, more flaws reported. But here's an example of how 86.9% of those are unproven, and there's just a few that are functional, and there's just a couple that are high. Okay, so that tells you, like, there are a lot of flaws out there. Maybe you want to focus on them. Maybe it's a waste of time because no one can do them. But let me dig in a little bit and tell you what I mean. 99% of those are actually unique, right, out of the 106. So you're already saying they're duplicates, so the number goes down quickly. Now 7 of them are actually VMware code. Now, this is a point of pride, of course, if you're VMware saying, hey, someone else's code is broken. It might not matter to you if somebody gets in through Apache or Tomcat or VMware, but from a VMware perspective, they're saying, yeah, make sure you're testing other code too, or make sure that as a pen tester, you're looking at the right target, right? You're not fixing ESX at this point. And then 3 of them actually are ESXi, but none of those have been proven yet. So out of all of the unproven attacks, right, the only ones which are really ESXi attacks have not been proven yet. And if you're familiar with the Joanna Rutkowska philosophy, she's a nice person and stuff, but she's adamant about her philosophy of you must fix this flaw I found in the blue pill or red pill or whatever she called it. And yet, when people approached her and said, show us the flaw, show us the exploit. We can find it before you could ever get even, within any meaningful distance of our servers. She was unable to prove it. And then when they said, well, we'll pay you money to prove it, she asked for hundreds of thousands of dollars to prove it. At which point it goes back to your threat model. If it costs you hundreds of thousands of dollars to prove this simple exploit of ESXi, A, people aren't going to attack it. They're going to go some other route. They're going to look at Jetty on Shodan, right? They're going to use something that's obvious. And B, if it costs that much money, who's going to be able to afford it? They really have to be motivated. So that brings into a lot of other threat profiling issues. So I'm not defending VMware. They're just saying, if you look at those data points on CVEs, be careful about what you're looking at. So with that being said, here's a good one, CVE 2009-3733. This one works and is very dangerous. This is directory traversal on a host. So you can go from a VM and grab any file on a host, any file. You can grab a VM. A VM's a file, right? So we talk about this all the time. This actually happened. Not a lot of people talked about it, I guess, publicly, maybe a little bit. It was fixed a while ago. Came out in 2009, obviously, so it was fixed long enough ago that you should be patched for sure. But if you go into, just as an example, Metasploit, which is on the Backtrack CD, you can run this. You can go into the console. You can run the tool here, which is the VMware Server Directory Traversal Attack. You just set it to the IP you want to attack, and then you run it. And then it attacks and tells you if you can get the files or not. Pretty cool. Note the caveat, though. You have to have access to the network on the host. So it goes back to doing a good job figuring out whether you can get to that network at all. Once you get to the network, you get the IP, get embedded in there, definitely look for CVE 2009-3733. It's an old one, but it's a really good one. And it proves the theory that guests can get data off hosts that are not their own data. All right, so with that in mind, right, we talked about the sort of extreme where you can't get anything to the extreme where you can get everything. So I'm going to take you through the top 13 results, and I'm going to give you the 5 highest issues right now. So this is from Zone H, where they say these are actual sites that are breached, right? It's kind of like the Verizon report, but this is from websites that are defaced or servers that have been taken offline. So you can see file inclusion, attacks against administrators, web app bugs, and SQL injection. There's an unknown I took out, which is 91,000, but since we don't know what it is, I can't include it. A bunch of cool stuff after that. So first one, file inclusion. Many of you may know that this is what Lulzsec did. So if you're worried about Lulzsec as a threat, I have a whole other talk about Lulzsec, but I actually recommend that you look at the AT&T court case. They filed against the guy who was supposedly affiliated with Lulzsec. There's an argument to be made that the DAs try to make the attackers look as dumb as possible. So that's just part of the process of taking people to court. So they do make this guy look really stupid. I think that's how they write the court complaints. But on the other hand, it is kind of silly that this guy was an insider who used his own account on regular business hours and just downloaded files from a server that they gave him access to, and then he uploaded it out to some, public share like a Dropbox. I think it was called Gorilla or something. And once it was out there, Lulzsec claimed that they had leaked this information, how cool they hacked AT&T. So AT&T basically went and said, well, we see his user went to that server, and then his user went to that public share site, so he's the guy. And they now are arresting him and putting him in jail. And incidentally, he was a call center worker, so they hired him as a contractor to answer phones. You know, when you call on your mobile and you're like, hey, I don't have service? That guy was sitting there pulling down, like, sensitive AT&T information and leaking it out and saying, I'm Lulzsec. Anyway, that's the low end. On the high end, Lulzsec is doing file inclusion. So what that means is you can include stuff in PHP. You can write code that basically says, I will include something in order to process. So in this example, I give you a multi-tenant instance where it says get tenant, and you have Alice and Bob tenants, and then you submit that. The problem with the include is that a lot of times when you're including the tenant type, you can put in any kind of evil information. So this is a very generic example. Try not to reveal anything, but you see that the tenant can be a web shell that you write and you put on your remote site. So you can exploit remote code, which would give you shell access to that server you're attacking. You could do something where maybe they have upload capability. So you upload a file, which would be your shell code or an exploit, and then you use the include to run the exploit you just uploaded. These are actual attacks. You can use this %00, which cuts off the .php on the end, so then it just executes notes.txt, or it just posts the password file to the screen. So this is essentially what's happening. Like, people are writing code that has a lot of powerful capabilities, and they're not really sanitizing it. So very dangerous attack. Really good to test with. And there are a lot of test tools that look for includes. In fact, there's so many test tools that look for includes, you can actually look for known malicious or known vulnerable code. So in this case, you have a case where you can create a file. So you create exploit.txt, and then you tell it to run that exploit right? You put it in the URL, and it actually prints back the entire application. So people can steal your entire application just by using your include. And once they have your application, they can figure out how it works, run further attacks. So if you've done your proper discovery and enumeration, you've figured out that you're in this place where they're running old code or vulnerable code. Now the exploit actually takes you to complete control of their code. So let's talk about the next one. Admin password stealing and sniffing. Pretty obvious, stealing a lot of passwords. You can do it through the office, people traveling, Wi-Fi networks like here. How secure do you think this network is? How many times have you shared your password? Home employees, partners, right? A lot of people wait in Starbucks and set up rogue APs and try to get you to connect. So in other words, you can target people that are not using SSL. You can test apps that have leaks. Username leaks are kind of funny. Here's a couple examples. Anybody use Meetup? Not a lot of people? Well, Meetup's pretty big right now in San Francisco, and it really annoys me that every time you go there it says, if you type in an email address, it'll tell you it's the wrong password. That's just like Security 101. Don't do that. Don't give away usernames. In very large sites like Yahoo, Google, Facebook, they shouldn't be doing this. So Meetup to me is a disappointment, because once you have that email address, you know exactly who to attack. You know exactly what to look for. So another thing that comes up is the entropy of the questions that are asked. I used to do a lot of this work at Yahoo where people would say, well, let's ask them their favorite color. And I would say, I bet 80 to 90% of people are going to say blue. So why even ask? Or what was the first street you grew up on? I'm going to say, I need 5 types of wood, and I can guess. Like elm, walnut, right, oak. Most people grew up on those streets. It's just this weird entropy thing where we think about questions that we ask, but we don't think about how everyone's just like everyone else. So we try to make them facts that are easy to remember, which makes them easy to break. So admin passwords are pretty easy to... that was the Sarah Palin case. She used a lot of really dumb examples, and people just guessed them. So you can also brute force your way through by targeting an SSL connection, trying to create a cert. This happens a lot in virtualized environments. I find that people are into rapid expansion, so really great attack vector. If you want to exploit people this is the automation layer, who use the same cert over and over and over again, obviously you can go in and figure out that cert, use that cert. They can't tell the difference between you and them. They're not issuing secure certs. They're basing their trust on something which is easily reproducible. Same thing as the easy names to remember. They're basing their trust on a street name which is very easy to reproduce or guess. So the entropy is very important. And then there's, of course, man-in-the-middle attacks, which I'll talk about, and side channels where you can set up a fake AP like in Starbucks. All right, so here's an example of what that might look like. You have vCenter, and then you have ESX. So you set up a man-in-the-middle where you sit basically in the way, and you say, I'm going to block your destination to ESX, and then I'm going to spoof certificate on this new evil site that I set up, basically my new ESX. And then when you reconnect, because you've been disconnected, service interruption, network late, especially you're on wireless, right? If you see connections on wireless, you get in there and you go, oh, sorry, service disconnected. Oh, look, you're back. Welcome. Then they get this warning that says, oh, yeah, untrusted certificate, and everybody clicks through. It's not a guarantee, but generally people click through and they think, oh, something bad happened, and they're just in a hurry. And that's when you can dismiss the warning. They type their password in a couple times. You have the password to the environment. So trusted certificates are the answer. I'm not going to give you a lot of solutions. Those are available for extra, but these are a lot of the problems we run into. So another one is simple brute forcing. This is just a point in VMware vCloud Director where you can enable locking of a user account after a number of invalid login attempts. I find a lot of people don't realize that they can do this, so they leave that open. It creates a denial of service condition, but in my opinion that's often good because that tells you something else. It's bad if you have 1 million email subscribers and they all get DOSed, and then you have to re-enable them and so forth. But it's good if you're talking about an admin account, or a user account where you have few people managing vCloud Director, which generally should be the case. So people brute force through. All right, let's talk about web application bugs. Anybody recognize this guy? Nobody? I'm striking out on all these things. All right, well, this guy, he's 12 years old, and he won $3,000. That's him holding up the check going, I found a web app bug in Mozilla. Mozilla paid me because I sat down for a few hours and made $3,000. And it was really cool at first because he was like, all I did was open up a debugger. He used something called Debuggy. He went to their webpage, and he just checked the call stack. He basically just ran this thing, I think 9 days for a few hours. Quick way to make $3,000 as a 12-year-old. Better than paper routes. The thing is, if you go and actually read the bug notes, which I always do, the guy, like 2 months later, one of the developers said, that's strange. I'm sort of surprised that this was different but never noticed before. Like, didn't we fix these bugs a while ago? And sure enough, a couple months after that, a guy said, this is word for word, absolutely duplicate to a Unicode Stack Overflow. Here's the bug number. We found it in 2009. So a year later, somebody reopened the bug, essentially, or they reopened the vulnerability in the code. And this guy was just testing for old vulnerabilities. And what went from the press did not cover this at all. The press covered 12-year-old genius breaks in, Mozilla saying, he's a special kid, you got to pay him money. This is what we need, smart kids in America breaking into systems. Totally different pen test attitude from 1983. But when you read the actual code and you read the response from the development community, they're saying, oh, wait a minute, this guy's running like an old test, which is what they should have been doing, right? You should be doing. You should test for all of the old flaws first before you start looking at the great new exploits, because they'll be there. And maybe you can make some money on the side. So another one, you can run Skipfish. Here's an example from Backtrack. When you run Skipfish, it'll do a lot of really cool tests. So this is a tool that's constantly updated, and it'll tell you how many issues it finds by fuzzing your application. And you can set the fuzzing levels. So if you're familiar with fuzzing, it's basically just throwing random data at an input field and trying. It's like injection but different, because you're basically trying for a weird response. So if you ask one question, you get a response. You ask another question, you get a different response. This is actually what the Israeli army used to use to find people that were going to bomb them and keep people off their planes. They just ask the same question over and over again, and when they get different responses, they go, "You're somebody dangerous." Police use it too in interrogations. So this is an automation of an old security concept. And so in this case, it found 2 high-impact vulnerabilities. And you'll see the response here is that it says, that's strange. I used this huge random string vector, and it came back and said, different response here and here. And then you can narrow down, in order to find the exact exploit, what the actual response should be. Well, you can figure out from the responses what type of software it's running or whether you have something interesting that you should be testing. So in the second example, this actually tells you that there's an arithmetic evaluation on the server side, which tells you very specifically how to do the attack. So you run Skipfish. It gives you a couple quick examples. It'll tell you your high-impact issues, and then you can go from there. Really super easy to exploit apps that way. So Black Hat, strangely enough, when I get on the SQL injection, had only 2 presentations on database security out of 83. Now, remember how I'm talking about the top 5? We're on number 4, and they only had 2 presentations on database security. Maybe I'm a little jealous because I didn't get to present at Black Hat. I did submit. I submitted on virtualization flaws, like really serious issues that I've found. And they're like, yeah, we don't want to hear about that. We want to hear about insulin pumps, because insulin pumps, going down could change the world. Or, about the battery flaw they talked about, how Apple batteries have a chip in them, and the chip has documentation, and somebody read the documentation, and it had the password in it. That's huge news. So I kind of feel like Black Hat in a way. I'm not denigrating them, but I feel like they're kind of like the P.T. Barnum of security at this point, where it's like, have you seen an elephant before? You should see an elephant. It's pretty crazy. Look at this. You've never seen this before, have you? But that to me is not sophisticated. That's new, and new is not necessarily what you want to hear. You want to hear about attacks that are really relevant to your environment. And in a virtualized environment, in cloud environments, SQL injection is huge. It's going to be a huge majority of your attacks, not insulin pumps. Maybe you're in a hospital, but I doubt it. So SQL injection, basically, I'll just outline it, right? You've got an input field, kind of like fuzzing, but now you're putting in actual data that you think will get a response that you know whether or not it's going to do something. So in this case, instead of a username, somebody puts in a close quote, which closes the SQL query. It no longer is asking for SQL input. Now it's just going to process a command. So you close the query, and then you put in or 1 equals 1, which is a tautology. Tautologies are great. They're just like the Stuxnet argument when they say, if it's new, it's sophisticated. And if it's sophisticated, it's new. I don't think many people realize that we use tautologies in our language in the same way that SQL is vulnerable. So you use a tautology, and if the server runs that command, it can do a lot of bad things. So in this case, the attacker sends in an HTTP request like that. That's turned into an actual query, right? So it closes the SQL query and it starts the command. The command is to select everything from users where the username is nothing or a tautology. Well, since the tautology is true, it'll return the usernames, all usernames. So it runs that query, and even if your database is encrypted, even if it's on encrypted SANs, even if it's on encrypted fiber channel, everything's encrypted, you're still at the app layer, so it'll talk back to you and say, oh yeah, here's all the users, right, directly as you requested them. So that's, in a nutshell, running across a virtualized environment and pulling out all of the data. So what you're basically doing is you're enumerating, right, if we go back to the enumeration phase, all of the web form fields, everything, right? But not just inputs as you might think traditional sense. Look at cookies. Look at hidden files. Anything that the database is going to process. And so you can change the URL. A lot of people tamper with the URL because you see the queries in there. It's almost a habit after you pen test for a while. You look at the URLs and you look for any fields that you can change. And if you can null them out and run a command, you're SQL injecting. And so then you start to send these different characters to see if it responds. Different databases have different response types, so you can tell, that's kind of like fuzzing, what type of database they're running. And then, of course, you can run these reserved words with delimiters to try to get it to update, to run a time delay, to line feed. You're talking to the database directly. So back to virtualization in cloud, what does that really mean? You can come in through a C tenant to attack your A tenant, because if you can get in through their interface, B and C are sharing hardware, but they have a front end that's totally dedicated. The database is shared. So now you're running a query on the database saying, tell me all of the tenant IDs. Oh, look, the customer I'm trying to get to is actually one of the tenant IDs, because C has a vulnerable app running on that database. And then you can get a service ID, maybe that's unique to that tenant. This is a real-world case, actually. So in this case, you run a select query from the service where tenant ID equals, and then you get back all that information. People ask me all the time, how is co-tenancy more dangerous? Well, you're sharing space. Obviously, you can do things to other people that are in that space. So databases are a particular worry in pen testing. That's where we focus a lot. So let me look at this from a very specific example. I'm blending now patching. Verizon, again, will tell you that patching's dead. Don't worry about patching, because that's where the attackers aren't going to. But I would flip that around and say patching is just a handbook of vulnerabilities. It's not that patching is dead. It's that patching is really useful, like that Mozilla query. Like the guy, he figured out from 2009. I'm not saying he plagiarized, but somehow he ran the exact query using a tool and got the same result. They just happened to lose their patch. The patch went away. So in SQL injection, here's a CVE 2011-0787. If you run Oracle, I highly recommend you look at this. It basically allows people to go to a URL. This is, I believe it's called Enterprise Manager, so EM. So if you go to the EM, again, in your discovery phase, if you find, a web server, and then in your enumeration, you find that there's an EM subdirectory, wow, let's run CVE 2011 at it. And what that means is, I have to highlight this, it's a base score of 5.5, and you can't exploit it without authorization. But any authenticated user can execute SQL functions. Like, you have DBA access now if you can get to this website. And more importantly than that 5.5 is super misleading to me. They're rating it low, so people might not even address it, which is really good for a pen tester, because you're like, wow, all I have to do is figure out how to get a user account. Any user account. Anywhere, right? So remember how I was saying, you go into a meetup? If you find out people are working in a company and going to meetups, you can get their email address. From their email address, you can get their password. From their password and email address, you can probably figure out a username. Now you can go get DBA access to their database. It's a combination attack. Probably interesting, too, I don't know, for me this is fascinating because I get into the background of this stuff, obviously, is that this was noticed first in 2008, which is about the same time that Oracle was pushing their Unbreakable ads. So they were notified of this massive vulnerability at about the time that they were saying, we are unbreakable, right? And it says you can't break in, you can't break it. And they didn't patch it until 2011, April of 19th of 2011. You couldn't even talk about this before then because it was, vendor disclosure agreements and stuff. So disclosure came out a few days after the patch, which looks good. But seriously, this is the sort of thing we look for in SQL injections. You find a web page, you find injection, and then you basically look for things like service type, where you can give it queries, and then you can run commands based on poor coding. So, and I don't know if that stands out, but Enterprise Manager is generally in environments that are large, distributed enterprises that have lots of shared tenants, and so definitely a good one for cloud. And then finally, I don't want to take too much time, but the known vulnerabilities in unpatched systems, like the one I just talked about, here are a couple that you should really look for. CVE 2010-3301, I see this exploited still. It's super dangerous. I can't even believe people use this. This is like, people make fun of script kiddies, but I don't think it's really justified. This is a serious bug that if you still have, there's something, it's like the Pinto case, right? It's like you're driving an unsafe car if you have 2010-3301. And it's a Linux bug that essentially says if you have 32-bit and 64-bit, everybody runs 64-bit, so 32-bit is emulated. So basically everybody who's running 64-bit's vulnerable to root escalation. Anybody can get root on your box, bottom line. If you have 64-bit Linux and you have this, all they have to do is download a simple tool. I'll show you how easy it is. Right? So you download this thing called Robert You Suck. And and it's still there. It's very easy to get. You can modify it if you want, or you can compile it on the system that you've gotten access to. Of course, this assumes you have user access to the system, so there's a step involved. But then you just compile it, then you run it, and about a second later it says, hey, you're root. So it's a very good example of how you should be patched. But again, this is a 2010 patch, and you might be thinking, well, that's pretty recent. It actually is a CVE 2007-4573. Just like the Mozilla flaw, they made the mistake of reintroducing the vulnerability a year or so after they originally found it. So it came back. So people were testing for it, which again gives great credibility to the guy that finds it. He's like, I got root, but in fact he's just running an old test. So if you're a pen tester, run the old tests. Don't get too fixated on the future ones or the new ones. And then 2009-1244 is another good one to look at, as I talked about a little bit before. Really important to check out the ones that are involved with allowing guests to hop the host. Okay, so documentation. Basically, the executive summary, I think, is the most important part because that's the part that really makes the business change. I know it's seen as just fluff, but for me, that's really what's changed environments that I've worked on, getting people to buy in by doing a good job with the executive summary. The results of the test are super important to get people to move once the executives buy in. So that's where I talked about the dread sum. You get priorities based on assets. And then third, you have findings and recommendations. I do not think you should make recommendations about resource requirements and how to fix things because I think it's a conflict of interest. Other people disagree. But I find that if you're forced to report fixes for problems, you get into a situation where you won't report things that are broken that people don't know how to fix, which in the 83, I think it was 83, shuttle disaster, that was considered one of the biggest issues. They said, what's the problem? And the engineers say, well, it's really, really cold outside, and we've never launched a shuttle in this temperature before. We're not sure what's going to happen. And the management said, well, you don't have a fix? We're going to launch. And that's when the O-ring problem happened and the shuttle blew up. And later they went back and they looked at the data and they figured out, oh yeah, it's obvious. Now we can see exactly the problem. But at the time they didn't know it was the cold and why things didn't work. So requiring fixes can put you in a situation where you're not really looking at the serious problems. And then finally you should summarize the methods you used, which we talked about. So example executive summary. Here's what I'm talking about. If you can show people very quickly what's working, what's not. Here you have hosts, apps, database network, right? Different levels. You should focus on the host security, focus on your app security first. If you put it in a severity and likelihood map for the executives, they like that, where you can say, work on this one first, work on this one second, because the likelihood and the severity are mapped for them. Then it's tangible. I've been asked all the time, like, how do I get rid of the red? It's like they get fixated on the red. Get me out of the red. I just don't want to be red. You know, it's like executives fixate on simple things like that. So I find it very effective. So the top 3 findings and recommendations, first of all, never trust the client or a proxy to the client. This came up recently. I found that reverse proxies, because they're acting as a client, were trusted but didn't do authentication. So client to proxy would authenticate, reverse proxy to actual server wasn't checked. So people started to attack the reverse proxy to try to get control of it because then they could talk without being tested with the actual application. So always distrust the communication coming in. Sanitize all user input. There's an argument about whether you should sanitize input into the log. My answer is yes, absolutely. A lot of developers will argue with that and say whatever displays the log should sanitize the output, but you will get into situations where browsers are embedded and they read data. So you have to be careful that, you can't always trust the input is, I guess, what I'm saying. And if you protect yourself by sanitizing the input, you'll run into less issues where if you have broken output sanitization, people won't root your machine. I've seen it happen where people are able to use output. Let me give an example. Like a username field again. You put an HTML script command in the username field, which then gets logged. Then they go browse the log. It runs the script. All right, so stopping leaks. Definitely have to search and scrub for data on public and production sites and get yourself delisted where you find yourself. It's super important, but it's not required for compliance. So this is kind of an above and beyond step. I think this is just a threat-based step. If you really care about your organization, you should find out what people are reading about you, because that's going to factor into their attacks. And make sure you display consistent and very limited messages. So don't disclose usernames. If they hit your website over and over and over again, just say, yep, we still see you coming. You still get a 404. That's all you're going to get from us, nothing else. Right? The less data, the better. And third, reduce your surface to attack. So you want to broaden your scope. I'm a big fan of including everything because I find people come in the back doors all the time. They come in, like I say, they come in the way human behavior comes in. They find ways in. So if you limit your scope in a virtualized environment and say this is our CDE, our cardholder data environment, or this is only one tenant we're going to test, you can ultimately increase your risk because you're not accounting for that other tenant who has very weak controls. I'm okay with doing multi-layered security, but it just increases the burden. It means, for example, an administrator who's a slob who never cleans up after himself and a guy who's super anal working on military-grade security are coming into the same interface. You have to prove that the guy who's not doing good sanity checks is not affecting that other guy. It's not that you can't do it. It's just you've now increased your cost a lot because you have to prove every time he comes in he's not doing something bad. So, and that goes back to unique users, least privilege, right, to perform tasks, and then, of course, strong authentication. So really it boils down to three things. I don't think you should fixate on the really sophisticated attacks. I don't think they're really that important. They're interesting, but it's really not where people are getting in. It's really the good enough issues. People don't, like Stuxnet to me was a good enough attack, not very sophisticated. They knew a lot about the inside of that environment, but maybe they're insiders. Maybe they're from Iran. Doesn't matter to me. What matters is that to protect against that attack is not very hard. So second, don't skimp on scope. Make sure you check all the doors, not just the front, and always follow the paths of least resistance. If you run into a $100,000 bug issue, it's probably not going to get breached. Look at the other ones that are $5 or $10. And then finally, developers aren't infallible yet. So keep checking, even if they've made mistakes before. Don't say, okay, you fixed that, move on. Say, okay, now we know that you've made that mistake before, so we'll keep testing you on that, right? It's like doctors saying, well, you've been a diabetic once, so we're going to keep testing your blood sugar now for the rest of your life to make sure you don't go back to being diabetic or to make sure it doesn't get worse. I think that's an important thing to look for as a pen tester. I got an argument about this slide actually because people were trying to convince me that that polar bear is just rolling around, and I'm trying to say, no, he didn't realize it's ice. He slipped and he fell. But apparently they're saying that's just normal polar bear behavior. Like developers. They don't care. All right, so in conclusion, what we've talked about today is how to set up and run the cloud penetration test, and then really how to get the most benefit from those tests. This is the model that I tried to show you, right? Do a lot of discovery, do a little bit of exploitation, and then document well so that you know what your priorities are. And there are a bunch of references I can give you. NIST, like I said, I'm a big fan of. PCI has a penetration testing guide. There's the open source security testing methodology, which is kind of heavy, so I don't really recommend it, but there are definitely guides out there. And then I used Backtrack, Metasploit, and I used some tips from Nibblesec here. And I run a site called Flying Penguin. So if you fill out a survey from your mobile device, I guess, you get something. I'm not sure what, but I'd appreciate it if you filled it out and let me know how I did. Thanks, and that was the presentation.